Yeah, cool. So it's going to be great to talk to you. And what do you do in information security?
So I'm a startup guy.
Oh, okay.
I've always joined startups at early stage.
Yep.
With an employee number like 50 at Proof Point.
Oh.
I was their general manager for Canada at the time. A long time ago. We were 45 people.
Yeah.
I was a co-founder of a couple companies. Not all of them successful.
Yeah, well, that happens. I mean, even in tech, the failure rate is still pretty close to 1 in 10. So,
I completely agree with you. It's funny because we used to say that the odds of you raising seed round was like very, very low. But even after that, your odds of succeeding is minuscule. So it's like I think it's like just getting to Series A, you already beat the odds by a factor of 10.
I can imagine. It's the ones that don't get past that you don't hear very much about. There's one obvious reason is they didn't get the noise, the attention that would help them get to that next level. But
yes,
it's definitely very interesting.
And what's interesting as well is that, and we kind of getting right into it, is that, and this is what happens when you get somebody who's a practitioner. You always end up talking shop, and it's really interesting because just from my experience being at startups, you have all those early adopters where they're like they really were the ones who are sticking the neck out,
right,
from adopting technology, and then the rest of them are followers. So, I remember even APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, was a nothing until at some point in time everybody bought into this idea of a nation state.
Exactly.
And then all of a sudden it went like a hockey stick. But even then there were like, there's so many followers, but FireEye was number one, and the rest was, I always say, number one was Fire, and number two was FireEye.
Right.
Everybody, all those other 100 of companies that claim to do APT did not go anywhere.
Well, it's funny you mention that because like the MDR space right now, there's 180 companies doing MDR. If you talk to like Forrester and Gartner and look around a little bit, and that doesn't include like every system integrator I've talked to in the last 2 years says, "Oh, we do MSSP, we do MDR stuff too." And I'm like, "Holy cow! Like, when is consolidation going to hit this industry?" Because there's no way 180 companies can reasonably compete. Even though there are thousands and thousands of companies that need good security, that need that kind of SOC in a box capability, there's no way 180 companies can survive and be scalable and be supportive and meet the needs of those companies. But I have no idea what's going to actually cause the fallout and when. And I've already heard like, "Oh, well, this company," I was talking to a guy the other day, he's like, "Well, we bought 3 other companies and combined the 4 of us, and then we took the best of each part." And I was like, "Well, that's great. We got 175 to go."
And on top of that, integration of various technologies into one is not trivial.
Right.
They always talk about the fact that, okay, we bought companies, so then what? Like, it's on paper, looks great.
Yeah.
They tell the employees, "Oh, keep doing what you're doing," and then 3 months later, shit hits the fan, and they do reorg, and then the best leave, and then you end up with some source code or that is non-maintainable. So combining forces, especially when things as trivial as company culture, might be completely different.
Oh yeah, the company culture is a huge driver for whether or not any integration is successful, whether or not people stay, how long you're able to keep them, what kinds of things support that activity. A lot of people don't understand how important culture is, but there's, I spent the last 10 years in consulting, and there's a saying in strategic consulting that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
I love that.
and it's completely true. Like, you can have the best strategy in the world, and if the culture doesn't support it, you don't end up getting anywhere.
Yeah.
And so it is really interesting to think about where's the industry going? Where are some of the different components? Who's going to be first mover? And jumping into the startup space is always like taking a leap of faith that you've looked around enough on your own due diligence to think, okay, this company I'm signing up with, I think can make it. And your experience going through that a few times, I think gives you an advantage in picking where you try to put your foot next. For me, I've worked with a couple of startups. I'd have to think and count. Probably two hands full over the years. While I was at NSA, while I was at Bank of America, less so while I was at Booz, but still constantly keeping an eye on what things were doing. And I think that gives me a pretty good eye on the market, where things are and what we could be doing, and then thinking about where might I want to go next, or who do I want to work with next, and thinking about picking up startups and that kind of stuff.
And what's your take on the the crazy valuation for some of these companies? Like, we've seen 300x.
Yeah.
From a perspective of an investor. And it's funny, because when the stock market is booming and there's free money flowing, it's like the music is playing, so everybody is great. But then there's a certain point where we're seeing now there's a kind of a bit of a turn in the markets, and then now what? How are they going to catch up with revenue to get to that valuation? It's almost impossible.
I'd love to have a really good macroeconomic study of the VC space, but what I see is that there is a lot of money out there looking for better than 3 to 5% returns. And some of it is money that's looking for better returns so they can bring an average up. Some of it's looking for other kinds of safety. But if you look at like an individual VC fund, they're willing to throw away half or more of their money for the one or two things that get 10x, 20x, 100x return. And that averages out for them, for the fund, and for their investors. But it means that there is a lot of money getting thrown away in these processes. And you wonder if there isn't some better way to do it. And so, up until everything kind of slowed down the last couple months, you could talk to people and it's like, oh yeah, I put a business plan on a napkin and brought in a coder, and the two of us did a rough like wireframe of the user experience, and we put it in front of 5 VCs and we got $100 million. And you're like, what? and
it happens more than once, Todd.
It happens all the time, and it's been happening more and more. Because I think there's a crazy amount of money. So you start thinking sovereign wealth funds. You think Elon Musk has $40 billion or something to go play with just for Twitter. And I think that's only like a half or less than a tenth of his wealth, right? God only knows what Jeff Bezos and his wife could be doing with their money, right? And if you think about it, and I do tend to think about it this way, if you think about the global economy and the difference between the rich and poor, you got to wonder, like, could Bezos be worth $200 million instead, or $200 billion instead of $500 billion, and pay all of his employees enough that they could afford to buy his services, right? You think, Henry Ford is very famous for paying his workers enough that they could afford to buy his cars. And when you look at the economics of retail, like Walmart or many other kinds of businesses, yes, the guys at the top have found a business model, done something really cool, and created a ton of value. But at the same time, they're also keeping a very tight squeeze on every dime that goes out the door. And at some level, that's impacting people's livelihoods, people's ability to do things, people's own ability to have time and energy to have a rich life, to build their own spirituality, to build their own lives, to build their own families, and so forth. And you just wonder, like, could you be like a little bit less greedy and give a little bit more,
But maybe Todd, maybe they don't need to afford to buy a car. Maybe it's it's fine for them to have enough money to pay for a Netflix subscription and HBO and have enough money to pay their phone bill.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, you know, there was Ready Player One. The movie came out a couple years ago. The book was a few years before that, and it posits that future where half the planet or half the population or more is on welfare, and then there's a few lucky people that have jobs and can afford to kind of like go on vacation and do cool things, right? And look, I'm happy. I'm making enough money to go have a good vacation. I was telling a buddy of mine last night, we decided to go to Key West for Easter. Didn't even plan like, you know, months ahead, but looked at 2 weeks ahead, found a wait list to take a seaplane trip out to Dry Tortuga National Park, which is this island 80 miles west of Key West with a big brick fort on it from the 1800s. And the only way to get there is by boat or by seaplane. And we spent 6 hours snorkeling and wandering around the park and watching the birds, and it was beautiful.
Todd, we'll have the same experience, but in the metaverse. And we'll hand over tactile suits to everyone. So all they have to do is, you know, press on a button, and instead of taking you 6 hours to get there, you're immediately going to be immersed in the
experience.
Yeah, in the experience.
I don't know if I want to live in that world. I mean, I can be honest about it. It's like, that would be very cool. Like, it'd be cool to do a virtual trip to Jupiter, like, you know, or, you know, wander around Mars or something. But I don't actually know if I'd want to spend. I think there's something about being in a physical place and all of the things that come with it. And I mean, you know, I loved like some of the original cyberpunk books where you like plug in the back into, you know, right into the back of your brain, and you're there, and it's no difference that's discernible. I don't know if I want something jacked into my brain.
Well, they're already doing that, experimenting on, you know.
Oh yeah, Tesla's got Neuralink and stuff. It's coming. I just don't know if I want to be around for it. But maybe I do.
I think the best movie that, you know, basically conveys all of that is WALL-E.
Yeah.
If you remember, they're just sitting on the chairs, floating around.
Yeah.
In great physical shape, but
you made me think of WALL-E too, because I was thinking about big blobby people in sweatsuits.
Yeah, and they have the screen right in front of them, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely going to be interesting. I was talking about this problem in a different way earlier today. We're talking about China, and I don't know if you've spent much time in China. I haven't, so all my stories about China are secondhand. But you know, they have 1 billion people, and you have to give those people something to do and give some meaning to their lives. It's kind of fundamentally human, like telling stories and talking like we're doing. And so they do things like they'll have a big office building with little tiny trash cans so that people have a long all-day job going around emptying the trash cans. And I don't think emptying trash cans would be any more meaningful than sitting in a suit all day. But there's something that we're going to have to figure out as a species and as nations with how do we help manage billions of people, right? I mean, just in our lifetime, the planet's grown from like 3 billion people to over 7 billion people. I think we're on a fast track toward 9 billion people.
I think we're going to cap at some point. For sure. I think that there's going to be an end to that. But and I think what's happening in the technology is so fast that we forget we're creatures of evolution that took millions of years. So that, for example, telling stories, that's how we passed on our collective knowledge, is sitting in front of the fire and telling stories, and all of that is disappearing now because we're not doing that anymore. We're using text that has autocomplete. So we are being taught to not think at all, like just press autocomplete and you're good.
Well, we're also telling stories in different ways, right? I mean, you look at some of the stories that you can see on Netflix or HBO or pick your channel. There's some amazing stories out there that we're getting to see and witness in very different ways than our ancestors could ever have imagined. But there is a challenge fundamentally that our pace of technology change is rapidly outpacing our ability to change and adapt to that individually to some degree, but especially as a culture. Culturally, I think we see a lot of cultural tension because technology is bringing changes before we're really ready to understand what those changes are going to mean to us.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the social media is causing a lot of harm that way because we're being fed, I guess what we are after, any tendencies are getting fed, and we're becoming extreme of both ways.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about, you have like amazing experience, you mentioned, so I'd love to kind of dial into that a bit. And, people said it's always a fork in the road that you picked, and you end up like at RSA in 2022. So, walking around the booths and talking to people.
How did I get here? So it's really interesting when I look back on it, right? And I was telling you before we started recording, the two best classes I've ever taken were typing, where I learned to actually do like 40 or 50 words a minute, which has come in handy any number of times in my career, and theater, which got me thinking about how you present yourself, how you tell stories, why you tell stories. We did a section on improv, and I like to think that you could put me on a stage here at RSA, give me a microphone and ask me a question, and I could do a 50-minute talk almost without breaking and just improv it. I've been around in the industry for about 30 years, and so I think I could do that, and that's been, I think, a really good help to my career. So how did I get to that, right? Well, stupid thing, high school, it's like, oh, Todd, you're smart, you should go take AP English. And I'm like, I don't want to work that hard. So I took theater as an English class instead of AP English. And then early on, I was interested in electrical engineering and electronics, and I'd done the Boy Scout thing, and Boy Scouts started this thing called Explorers while I was at that age in high school. And I started doing an electrical engineering explorer group, worked at with the university because I grew up in a university town, which I have to say is a huge advantage. And then I started school and started college. And as I was halfway through my freshman year, my mom looks at me and says, Todd, why don't you call up that engineering professor and see if he can help you get a summer job? Mm-hmm. And I did, which was one of those weird teenagers that wasn't pushing back on authority. And I talked to the professor, and I ended up with a summer job at the Naval Research Labs in Washington, D.C. And this was the old days, so of course I get in a car at the beginning of summer with an address for a guy who's going to let me rent a bedroom for the summer, and an address where I'm supposed to show up on Monday morning for the processing for joining up. And there's no cell phone, so there's maps and
what's amazing is that there is so much more work associated with anything. Today, like, people don't realize like how easy they can just go on like Airbnb and figure things out and then show up. There's Google Maps, there's ways, all kinds of things. Back then, everything had to be
I wasn't even emailing these guys, right? Yeah. Like, I'm getting them on the phone, figuring out how we're going to talk, finding this guy who's a friend of the guys I ended up working for at the Naval Research Labs, who rents me a room. And at the tender age of 18, I go off to spend this summer job in my freshman year with no contact with my mom, or my parents, right? It's like, okay, Sunday nights I'll try and call you guys, right? And I'm paying for the long distance phone call in cash, right, with the guy I was staying with. So I showed up at the Naval Research Labs, and they're like, oh, well, you don't have a clearance yet, but we got all the paperwork going, so we're going to have you do this stuff. And I ended up working in a group that did cryptography for the Navy, and they worked on radio security encryption devices. They worked with NSA built equipment, but they were doing some of their own research. Really cool, a lot of fun stuff. And eventually, over the next 3 summers, I got a clearance. I did more work with them. I actually built a little Fortran program that did A to D conversion out of one encryption box. Then took that, processed it, did the conversion back, and decrypted it out of another box, so that I was basically encrypting a data stream with one box, decrypting it with the other box to prove that the 2 boxes were using the same crypto algorithm, right? So fast forward at 3.
That's your summer intern job?
That's my summer intern job.
Like, how many people in the entire country do you think were doing that particular intern jobs?
Oh, I can't imagine there was anyone else doing anything like that, right?
It's so unique.
One of the boxes was built to do digital encryption, and the other box was actually built to do voice encryption. So I'm actually breaking in between the voice processor and the data processor to get the right data set, to be able to compare the 2 data and make sure that what was getting encrypted and what was decrypted out were the same data sets. So then I finish up and I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to apply for a job at a college. And I'm like, I applied at NSA, I applied at CIA, and I applied at RCA. And I show up for the interviews at NSA, and they start telling me all this great stuff, including how they've done all this work to show that these 2 boxes that I worked on the summer before actually work together. And they're like telling me all the work that I did, and I'm just like, okay, I'm not going to take credit for this. I'm just going to let it go.
But it's amazing. How did you know even these organizations exist? I mean, were they like radio ads? Or?
No, so my college professor hooked me up with the Naval Research Labs. Mm-hmm. And the Naval Research Labs, I get so many stories about this because we literally worked in a vault. Like, I'd walk into a vault door in the morning, and it's a no-loan zone. So if you're the last 2 people there at night, the 2 of you have to close the door together. You have to call security to make sure it's crazy stuff.
But didn't you say that you were an English major, or like you were like studying?
No, I was studying electrical engineering. Right. But so it was the English, AP English in high school I didn't want to do. College, I'm like electrical engineering,
which is very tough, by the way. There's a very any STEM, but that one particular is very, very difficult.
Well, I don't know if you've ever been to engineering school, but the engineering schools have like this hierarchy, right? Like chemi is the hardest, electrical engineering is the next hardest, and everything else is below that. And like if you're in like civil engineering, you're barely better than a English major.
Right. And then there's computer science somewhere.
Yeah, I don't even know where. But because I was at the Naval Research Labs and we were using this NSA equipment, and I wasn't actually talking to NSA people, but I was hearing about NSA through that. And then some of my college friends were like journalism majors, and they're hearing about NSA because NSA loves to recruit in some weird areas for certain kinds of skills. And it turns out journalism majors make really good intelligence analysts. And West Virginians are really well known for working hard. And between the 2 of it, I had friends that literally got out of journalism school and became intelligence analysts. And I kind of went into, not through that, but through the engineering. And I will tell you, I would tell anybody, coming out of college, one of the best things you could do is go into government work, come into NSA, come into any of those places, because there's more responsibility there than any place else. When you think about the military, right? They'll give somebody a couple years out of school, like, here's your plane, go fly it, and do what you got to do.
It's the same.
And so 3 years out of school, I'm running programs to build little green boxes, and I'm responsible for $750 million in contracts.
Yeah, and you were what, 20?
Yeah, 25.
Yeah, it comes up to be sometimes absurd cases where you can fly an F-16, but not able to drink, or not able to get a motorcycle because you're not there old enough.
Yeah. Well, so So the other thing you get into in the government that you don't think about as much in private industry is policy, and how policy and regulation impact business and how those things impact. So I got to NSA, I started, and like almost literally my first week, my job was to declassify 128. Like, I got there, the fact that we used crypto that had 128-bit keys was classified. Mm-hmm. And I wrote the declassification memo, and eventually, of course, it went up and got signed by everybody. And so I declassified the number 128.
Unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And also, what people don't realize, like the amount of training, the intensity associated with it. It's not like when you get a job in the private sector, you have a job in 9 to 5, and you get trained for a few weeks at a time, and then you kind of like, but you're off most of the time, because most of the waking hours you're doing something else. It's not the case with these training courses. It's very intense. So 6 months training as an NSA intelligence analyst. The amount of, don't you, like some folks learn languages within 6 to 8 months?
There's relatively short language courses. There's a bunch of courses. I did a bunch of cryptography courses, obviously. I had training manuals on all kinds of stuff. I helped write training manuals. I did training for other people. I took training. I'd never gotten more education than I did at NSA.
And by the way, cryptography is tough. People don't realize that there's this easy topics and there's hard topics. Anything to do with cryptography, and even people don't realize that now it's all seamless. So the entire web is based on some shared keys and so on. But the underlying cryptography elements, or in the whole logic behind it, is very difficult.
I was actually talking Sunday to a guy who does innovation at one of the big banks, and one of the things they're working on is trying to be able to seamlessly replace algorithms, right? Because right now the algorithms are kind of so embedded into the code and the products and things that we all use, that being able to simply change from algorithm A to algorithm B is just ridiculously hard. And yet, as we look at quantum computing coming up and creating a kind of a singularity around old cryptography and quantum resistant cryptography, you have to be able to not just think about changing the algorithm once for that big quantum change, but I had to be able to negotiate algorithms as easily as I negotiate key lengths, as easily as I negotiate other things that have to do with cryptography. It's funny, I actually ended up going on this really interesting trip into Europe to meet with one of the other governments. And literally they chose me because I knew enough about the cryptography to be able to talk about it, but not enough to give away anything mathematically.
And so it's so interesting you just mentioned it. So we see that simplification of the underlying layers. So like, serverless, codeless, now, the cloud is basically kind of the abstraction layer of computing. So now what you're telling me is there's going to be a movement, movement towards algorithmless.
Oh yeah,
where there's an abstraction layer, so all the algorithms underneath are basically seamless.
Well, and it's a full circle, because like in the 90s, I was doing all this work on computer security there, because I ended up like 10 or 12 years at the agency. My last few years, I was working all on commercial cryptography, commercial security, outside security stuff, and so we were literally meeting with companies like Microsoft and Netscape and working on protocols that would negotiate key length as part of the SSL exchange. That would at some point we were probably talking about negotiating the algorithm that you would use as part of that negotiation. And a lot of that has kind of disappeared and gone away. But there was a time when like Microsoft Crypto API was a really big deal because of what it meant for the ability to slip a commercial algorithm like DES out of the way and insert a government algorithm that you could then feel comfortable with for classified material.
So there's a lot of smart people that are, looking ahead, and quantum computing always, the people are saying that it's going to break the internet eventually. So, we're talking about apocalypse. That's when there's no, shared secret that it's secure.
Right.
Have you seen any development around that? What is the government and some other, I don't know, whatever you can divulge?
Well, I haven't had a clearance for years, and so I don't know much about what they're doing. But there was a really great set of articles I noticed came out around March, April this year. And the summary, like the TLDR for that was, they've been telling us for 30 years that quantum computing was 10 years away, and it's still 10 years away, and maybe there never will be the breakthrough in quantum computing. And I've had this discussion with a few people since, and I think quantum sensors are very interesting. The things that you can do around that are very interesting. There's some really cool things you can do with quantum processing that's not the traditional quantum computing, but like building communication channels where any kind of upset in the channel creates quantum disruptions that are detectable. And that alone, I think, is going to create some really interesting things for us. We were kind of playing this mind game with it the other day and saying, what if ghosts, right, which everyone's like, oh, there's no such thing as ghosts. Well, if you start thinking about quantum entanglement and the idea that I could have, two pieces of some satellite, one that I leave here on Earth and one that I send to Pluto, and then I can instantly communicate by quantum entanglement. What if ghosts are quantum entanglement? We just haven't figured out how to sense that yet.
And what excites me is that I think we're just in the beginning of another revolution, right? So there was industrial revolution, now the tech, and things seems to be accelerating. In all regards, and we use technology almost seamless without even thinking about the underlying. What was the computing power that Apollo 13 went to the moon with? It was like it was like a 486.
No, it was like a 4040. Yeah. Right, it was like a 4-bit computer. Right, it was ridiculous. Your average your average semi-intelligent watch, right? Forget an iWatch. Yeah. Like think just a bare minimum watch has more computing power than the lunar module did. And what we've seen is that we still have trouble as humans wrapping our head around what exponential growth really means. And Moore's law has defined this exponential growth in computing power and in our ability to do things with that computing power that A is now going on the upslope in a way that we can barely comprehend, and B is just overwhelming in its power, right? It's half the size, twice the processing power, every so little bit. Oh, and the cost goes down at the same rate. And it's amazing what you can start to do when you start thinking, well, 10 years from now, how much could I do, right? Processing, like voice processing, natural language processing that 10 years ago was, I'll say, kind of barely ready to go, is now sitting on like every mobile device we have. And my wife finally just figured out that for her job, her latest tablet does processing well enough that she's given up, for the most part, typing her reports. She just dictates her reports now, and they're 99% correct. A year from now, 2 years from now, they'll be almost perfect, and they do it in 130 languages. Right? It's kind of beyond comprehension.
And I think the collective benefits for everyone, across the planet by having the technology, because, despite the kind of the naysayers, and we're living in a very, very good times. We
really are.
We really are. People don't realize that if you look back at the history, we've gone through some major, dark times, and in the past, 30, 40, 50 years since Second World War, we've done really well for ourselves. There's a lot of people getting out of poverty every day, and technology is essentially benefiting everyone. You can be living in a third world country and still have infinite access to to data and information on your mobile device at no cost almost.
So you're asking how I got here. So I'll do what the TLDR is: a dozen years at NSA, a dozen years at Bank of America, and the last 10 years in commercial consulting, and then now starting my own consulting company. But along the way, one of the things we did at the bank was we invested in the Center for Future Banking with the MIT Media Lab. And we spent a lot of time up there thinking about what does the future look like. And so this is back in like 2009 or so. And we're talking about smart contracts and electronically signed contracts, right? Which have just recently have kind of become really big, right? And we were all kinds of cool big ideas. But one of the other things we talked about was like how much power now is in somebody's hands, that some guy who got up early this morning, took his fishing boat out in, not even like far out into the Pacific from some island in like Fiji or Seychelles or, wherever, brought back a load of fish and can effectively use that phone to get on the internet and figure out where he's going to get the best price for his fish and know whether or not he's getting a fair price for those fish. And even since 2009, right, 10 years of growth in that, the phones that we have are so much more powerful. The applications are so much powerful. We were talking about getting like the second or third billionth person on the internet. And Zuckerberg has 3 million people or 3 billion people on Meta, and there's still another 4 billion to go. The numbers are absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and the efficiencies that we get from that collective benefit. And then I've heard like some numbers of how many GitHubs commit. Just last year was 70 million GitHub commits. Just a sheer number of development. And I'm thinking out loud, like, so what is it to develop? Like, everything is there. Isn't there enough libraries for everybody to use?
Hasn't it already been done? And yet it's not. So my dad did research in reproductive physiology for 50 years. And died last year, but literally had a paper that was getting ready to go to press and so was published after he died, and still learning new things about DNA, about how mRNA works, about what happens in different segments. There's just so much incredible research of things we don't know, even though some people act like, we already know everything. It's like, no, we don't.
So that leads me to the next question. Look at RSA, right? We're back in person, and it's 2022, and some people been to RSA like 20 times, 25 times. I don't know how many times it's been around, and the slogans are there. Like, it's kind of maybe some changes in terms, like zero trust and so on. But we, it seems like we're always losing the battle with the adversaries because they're all, they always say, okay, the attack surface is limitless, but then only have to break it once. But there's all these technologies, there's 3,000 vendors plus. Why are we not doing better in terms of and I know it's a big...
No, it's a really good question, but the answer is actually really simple. And the answer is because developers are responsible for producing results and user experiences. They're not responsible for security. We have been building capabilities into our code since the dawn of time, almost, right? Since we began writing code, it was, how can I build a cool spreadsheet? How can I make this computer do some calculation for me? And security has always been an afterthought for that. We had conversations with companies, because a lot of people don't remember, but there was a time when there were actually multiple operating systems on PCs, right? It wasn't all Windows and Mac and Linux, right? There were, and yes, and 500 flavors of Linux don't count. It's still Linux. But there was a Novell operating system. There was an IBM operating. There were all these operating systems, and we had conversations like this at the agency, and we asked, like, why can't you build more security in? And the answer was, everybody wants features, and the cost of adding a security feature is kind of small, but creating the documentation and the user experience around that so that people can actually take advantage of that security feature becomes like a 50x investment. And people would much rather have the next cool email feature than the next security feature. And it kind of boils down to that. The same idea that it's all about the features and the code capabilities and what you can do to create more power and more value for the business. Security is a need, but it's not the priority. It's a big challenge.
And you work now with, as a consultant for, some vendors and so on. So what is the kind of the main struggles right now? Why are not more companies doing better than they should? Because they're doing all the right things, right? It seems like there's almost like a formula that they follow, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned you get an idea on a piece of napkin, you get funded, and you hire talented developers and product manager and marketing and so on, and you go through like that template.
Yeah.
But there's somewhere along the way some things break and they don't make it.
Well, it's two things. So on the security vendor side, you have to attack a small enough problem that you can define the problem, because when you go, like if you watch the innovation sandbox over at RSA the other day, the first thing they're looking at is what problem, they're asking all the vendors, what problem do you solve? How do you solve it? How's the team going to actually make this a real business?
Is it a feature or a platform?
Exactly. Is it a feature? Right. And so you've got to make the problem that you're solving small enough to be able to sell it. Right. And then you almost have to go to like the analyst groups and say, look, we're not selling you a better firewall. We're selling you some new thing that we've just defined as a new category. And so we're like forcing people to sell not really security solutions, but unique security niche things. And that just fundamentally doesn't help us. And
it seems like that you have to fall within the category. You have to fall within the budgeted, allocated funds and project at it. Otherwise, enterprise is not going to look at you because they don't have time.
That's exactly right. You have to line up, like, so when you flip into that sales side, you have to line up like, I want to buy an A, and you have to then say like, okay, I'm selling A's, and then all of that has to line up, right? Or else you get really long sales cycles, which are the death of so many businesses, right? And we were talking about that. Tech isn't immune from the basic only 1 out of 10 ventures succeeds. And if you have long sales cycles, because you first have to explain that you're not selling apples, you're selling zebras, and then you have to convince people they want zebras, and then they have to go through a budget cycle to get money to buy the new zebra. By the time people are actually getting money to buy zebras, you've gone bankrupt because you couldn't sell any the first year.
And our practitioners getting jaded because they've been here so many times, and there were a lot of technologies that didn't quite make it. DLP at some point in time was like the be-all and end-all of data security. Then there were, orchestration, automation that, now it's EDR.
Well,
there's just so many different...
All those things go through a cycle. Somebody has, I won't say names, but somebody has a hype cycle that says, everybody gets inflated expectations, and then you have, some problems with disillusionment, and then things come back. And DLP is like a great example, right? Is one of the clients I'm working with, one of the companies, actually, like the business leader, the CEO, came over to the CIO the other day and says, isn't there some way that we could like block outgoing PII material from going out? And we're like, DLP. And so now I've got a DLP project that I didn't even have to ask for. But I think a lot of those technologies kind of go through that, where they get hyped up, nobody actually knows what to do with it, and then eventually people start to figure out what to do with it, and it also gets rolled back into things in a more mature way. So companies that didn't know what to do with DLP 5-10 years ago, it's now a feature of a larger product set, something like that.
In talking to executives, do they, how do they we all have budgets, right? You have limited budgets, but almost like if you look at it, almost unlimited risk associated with a business. How do they quantify where to invest next? Like what type of technology? I mean, that's kind of the $1 million questions. Like how do they do that today?
Well, so I think there's two completely different processes, right? There's like the process that a CISO uses to figure out what they need for security and how they're thinking about gaps in their compliance, and then gaps in what I call operational security. So if you're at a business today and you're regulated, like you're a bank, you're healthcare, you have to meet HIPAA, you have to meet, FINRA or some other set of compliance requirements, then filling up and meeting all your compliance requirements is kind of like table stakes. The flip side of it is it's 2022. There are crimeware gangs doing ransomware. There are nation states. If you're in the wrong kind of business or the right kind of business, the nation states are after you. There's operational things that you need to do regardless of the compliance things, right? You need to have multi-factor authentication. You need to patch on a regular basis. You've got to block as much spam as you can because users are not that discriminating. And I try and separate and think about those things that way. And then you try and manage your budget against how much risk am I going to have if I'm not compliant, and how much risk am I going to have if I get hit by ransomware, or business email compromise, or an APT, and then apply things. And that's kind of the art of what a CISO does, or what a security team does, is identify and talk about those risks. And then you talk about that with the business in terms of what's the impact of that going to be on their business. And I've seen companies that would say, look, the maximum fine if we're not compliant with some regulation is $50,000. So I won't spend more than $49,000 on security because the worst fine is $50,000. And you see other companies that are, because of the nature of their business, because of the way they think and talk about risk, because of their culture, they become much more interested in, what about this kind of cyber problem? What about those things? And one of the things that's been nice the last 7 years or so is that, there's headlines in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and the magazines that business leaders read saying you should be worried about this stuff. So we get to worry about it more. But you asked a question a minute ago, and I kind of went away from it. And that is, why aren't more companies meeting their security requirements? And the answer comes back to Wendy Nather's security poverty line. When you think about compliance and you think about it being 2022 and what you need to exist on the internet, there's almost a minimum set of things that a company of a certain size needs to do, right? And Fred's Garage doesn't need to do it, but California hospital system has to. And how you pull that out of the budget, and how you decide how much of those things do I have to do? Do I want to check the box that I have a SOC, or do I actually want to have a 50-person round-the-clock, multi-team, 24/7 set of security analysts? Then becomes how much risk am I willing to absorb, and how much risk am I willing to take?
And I think the compliance is such as, if you look at CMMC and the government, for example, Fred's Garage is going to have to be compliant in order for you to. And in a lot of businesses we're yelling and screaming, saying they're not going to be able to do business. And I think that the government is basically sitting there saying, well, but this also leads to $500 hammers, and there are downstream creations of this that we don't fully think through. And it's one of the problems with compliance is that it's checklisty, and it requires an expense that may or may not be the right thing based on risk. And I'll dive into that for a second, because I've had a couple good conversations already this week. It's amazing. You come in for a kickoff party, and you're already talking shop on Sunday night. It is amazing. That's why I love these in-person events, because you get to really go in the rabbit hole.
You can go down all kinds of rabbit holes. And so, way back in the early 05, in the 05s, early aughts. they were talking about banking regulation and saying, well, we're going to make all the banks do multi-factor authentication. And the banks got together and said to the regulators, are you really want to tell us what technology we have to use? That seems a little extreme, and things are going to evolve. What if you required us to do a risk analysis and then think about what we need to do to manage the risk for our online banking customers? And some people may decide that they can cover the risk of passwords alone being insufficient. Some people will add different features. Some people will do other things. And we did risk-based analysis back in 05, 06, 07, somewhere in that 7-8 time frame. We started rolling out some of the earliest multi-factor in U.S. banks at a time when European banks were required to have everybody carry tokens. And we used to worry about this problem of I'd have a necklace of tokens if I had multiple banks, and I have to remember which token goes with which bank. And full circle, now of course I've got 3 authentication applications on my phone, and like GitHub's on one and Microsoft is on one, and I don't even remember all the things I use multi-factor authentication for, but there's literally 3 authentication applications. They all do the same thing. They generate one-time passwords, sync to something for a particular I have a necklace of authentication applications. It's just on my phone.
And now you have to, when you get a new phone, which people do quite a bit, you have to remember to port all of those before you wipe up the phone, because in other words you end up like locked out of your accounts.
Exactly. And I know people have thought about it. It's an obvious problem is that you change phone, you lose it, you drop it in the ocean, but the recovery mechanisms are not always well thought out or easy. Definitely a problem.
And what's also interesting is that, every once in a while you wake up in the morning and you feel like there's a cybersecurity atom bomb that just exploded.
Right.
So the usual suspects were Log4Shell, Log4j. That it was like the sky is falling and everybody's vulnerable. And then we had the SolarWinds and the rest of but it seems like you wake up and a week later and it's almost like okay, you're off to the races, like nothing really happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have a few guys that gals that end up sticking around for the weekend, patching things up, and then a week later things are fine.
Exactly.
At least on the surface.
No, it can be really crazy. It really can be. I hate to do this. I just realized I'm late. I've had so much fun talking to you.
No, absolutely. That's been a real pleasure. I'm glad you managed to come out here, and we should do this again, maybe even virtually, or maybe at one of the other events if you're going to be in like Black Hat or the rest of it. And before we move on to the next, and you have to go, but I would love to, how do people get a hold of you if they wanted to?
LinkedIn. I'm the only Todd Inskeep on LinkedIn. There's one other Todd Inskeep. He's retired. It's pretty obvious. I'm the Todd Inskeep that you want to find. Awesome.
So thank you very much for joining me today. Much appreciate it, and really fascinating background. And I'll highly encourage for anybody with encryption questions to reach back out to you. You probably have more insight than anybody I personally know.
Love to talk to people. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Todd.